The coffee shop was busy on this Tuesday morning, filled with the usual blend of military personnel, defense contractors, and local business people who frequented establishments near Fort Liberty in North Carolina. Marcus Webb stood in line, still wearing his tactical gear from the 5:30 morning physical training session. His father, James Webb, sat at a corner table waiting with 2 cups of black coffee already prepared. Marcus was a quiet man. At 34 years old, he'd built a life that was largely invisible to the world. He was a single father of 2 boys, Daniel, age 6, and Tommy, age 8. He worked as a logistics coordinator for the Army, a mid-level position that allowed him flexibility to manage his children's school schedules and after-school care. He'd been in the military for 12 years, and in that time he'd learned that drawing attention to himself was rarely a good thing. His father, James Webb, was a different kind of man entirely. James was retired, had been retired for 20 years, and he had the kind of easy confidence that comes from a career well-lived and nothing left to prove. He'd served 25 years in the Army and had done well by his pension and a successful private security consulting business. Now, at 62, he mostly helped his son with the boys and offered the kind of quiet wisdom that only a man who'd lived a long life could provide. "The boys doing okay?" James asked as Marcus sat down with his coffee. "They're good," Marcus said. "Tommy made the soccer team he was trying for. Daniel's got a science project due next week. The usual stuff." James smiled. "You're a good father, Marcus. I hope you know that." Marcus didn't answer. He'd never been good at accepting compliments. Instead, he changed the subject. "How's the consulting business?" They sat together for another 15 minutes, 2 men comfortable in companionable silence, drinking their coffee and watching the world move around them. This was their ritual, Tuesday mornings before Marcus headed to work and James headed to his office downtown. It was one of the few constants in Marcus's life. When it was time to leave, Marcus stood up and hugged his father goodbye. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. It meant family. It meant continuity. It meant that no matter what happened at work, no matter what the military threw at him, he had this. That afternoon, everything changed. Marcus was in the commissary picking up groceries for the week's meal prep. He did this every Tuesday after work, buying chicken breasts, rice, vegetables, simple food that he could portion out and reheat throughout the week. It was efficient. It was practical. It was exactly the kind of thinking that kept a single father with 2 kids and a military career afloat. He was standing in the checkout line when he heard the voice. Well, if it isn't Marcus Webb." Marcus turned to see Admiral James Hartley standing a few people back in line. The Admiral was a legend at the base. Everyone knew his name, his story, his reputation for brilliant tactical thinking and ruthless command decisions. Hartley had published a best-selling memoir about his SEAL team operations. He'd been profiled in major magazines. He was, in every way that mattered in military circles, a big deal. Marcus immediately stood at attention. "Admiral, sir, good to see you." Hartley waved a hand dismissively. "At ease, Webb, just doing some shopping." He looked at Marcus's cart, the simple, practical groceries, and his expression shifted into something that looked like amusement. "Let me guess, single-parent meal prep. I heard about you. You're the guy who takes care of 2 kids while working full-time, right?" "Yes, sir," Marcus said carefully. "That's impressive," Hartley said, and for a moment Marcus thought the Admiral might be genuine. Then Hartley continued. "Or desperate. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." Marcus didn't respond. You didn't argue with an Admiral. But Hartley wasn't finished. "So tell me, Webb," he said, stepping closer, his voice taking on a joking tone that made several people in line turn to look. "What rank do you think you've earned? Because looking at you now, doing your little grocery shopping, picking up your kids, trying to balance it all, I'm guessing you see yourself as pretty important, right? Pretty high rank. Or are you honest with yourself about being a middle manager with a babysitting job?" There was laughter from a couple of other officers in line. Marcus felt his face flush, but he kept his expression neutral. "I serve according to my ability, sir," Marcus said quietly. "Of course you do," Hartley said, and he patted Marcus on the shoulder in a gesture that was somehow more insulting than his words. "Keep up the good work with the kids, Webb. The military needs men like you. You know, the ones who understand their place." Marcus stood there as Hartley moved past him, chatting with another officer about some classified operation. The Admiral had reduced him to a joke in less than 2 minutes, and everyone in the commissary had witnessed it. That night after the boys were asleep, Marcus sat in his small living room and let himself feel the anger. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger. He wasn't that kind of man. Instead, it was a cold, settling anger. The kind that comes from being dismissed by someone you've never wronged. From being made small in public for the crime of trying to do right by his children. He thought about calling his father, but what would he say? An admiral made fun of me for being a single parent? His father would tell him to shake it off, that people like Hartley weren't worth the emotional energy. His father would be right. But Marcus couldn't shake it. Instead, he found himself thinking about his work, about his position, about the things he knew. Marcus had been working in logistics for the past 5 years, and in that position, he developed a specialty in tracking military movements, supply chains, and personnel deployments. It was classified work, the kind of thing that required a top-secret clearance and the kind of attention to detail that most people found tedious. Marcus didn't find it tedious. He found it interesting. He found that patterns emerged when you looked at the data carefully enough. He found that inconsistencies were visible if you knew where to look. And he'd noticed something interesting about Admiral Hartley's deployments and supply requests over the past 18 months. The movements didn't make sense. Not in a way that would be obvious to someone glancing at the data, but Marcus didn't glance. Marcus studied. Marcus paid attention to the small details that most people missed. He pulled up his classified laptop, the one the military issued to all personnel with security clearances, and started going through the records. Nothing incriminating at first, but there, in the supply requests, a pattern. Hartley had been requesting equipment for operations in Yemen, but the official record showed that those operations had been completed 12 months ago, yet the requests had continued for the past 6 months. Marcus dug deeper. He pulled up the classified operational summaries. He cross-referenced them with the supply chain data, and what he found made his chest tighten. Either Admiral Hartley was running covert operations that weren't being officially documented, or someone was stealing military equipment and using Hartley's name to cover it up. Both options were serious. Both options were the kind of thing that could end careers. Both options were something Marcus should report. But Marcus knew how these things worked. He'd been in the military long enough to understand that when you reported someone powerful, you became a problem. You became someone people wanted to get rid of. You became vulnerable. He thought about his sons. He thought about their stability. He thought about the fact that this job, this simple logistics coordinator position, paid for their house and their food and their school. And he thought about Admiral Hartley, standing in the commissary, making fun of him for trying to take care of his family. The next morning, Marcus called his father. "Meet me for coffee," he said. "I need to talk to you about something." When they met that Tuesday morning, 1 week after the incident in the commissary, Marcus told his father everything. He explained the anomalies in the data. He explained what he suspected. He explained the risk. James listened carefully without interrupting. When Marcus finished, his father was quiet for a long time. "You're sure about this?" James finally asked. "I'm sure there's something wrong," Marcus said. "I'm not sure what exactly, but something is definitely off." James leaned back in his chair. He was a man who'd spent 25 years understanding military systems, and he understood immediately what his son was facing. "If you report this and you're right, you'll be a hero," James said. "If you report this and you're wrong, or if you report it and it gets buried, you'll be marked as a troublemaker. Your career will stall out." "I know," Marcus said. "So why are you thinking about doing it?" James asked. Marcus thought about that. He thought about Admiral Hartley's mocking tone. He thought about being made small in public. And he realized that wasn't really why he was considering reporting this. "Because it's the right thing to do," Marcus said finally. James nodded slowly. "Okay, then here's what we're going to do." Over the next week, father and son developed a plan. They didn't go to Marcus's chain of command. That would be too easy to bury. Instead, they decided to build a case. They decided to gather more evidence. They decided to be thorough enough that when the information came out, it would be undeniable. But they also decided something else. They decided that if Admiral Hartley was going to treat Marcus like he was invisible, like he was insignificant, then Marcus would become someone Hartley could never ignore again. They decided to become the Phantom Wolf. Not a real phantom, not really a wolf, but a presence that Hartley would never quite see coming. A threat that would appear and disappear, leaving traces but never revealing itself until the moment it was ready to strike. Marcus began accessing the classified data more systematically. Not in a way that would trigger alarms, he was careful about that, but methodically, thoroughly, building a complete picture of the irregularities. James, using his consulting company's legitimate access to certain military databases, began cross-referencing the information with his own contacts and resources. Together they were building something. Not revenge, Marcus wasn't that kind of man, but accountability, justice, the kind of thing that an admiral couldn't ignore or bury or make disappear through connections and influence. It took 3 months of careful work, 3 months of secret meetings between father and son, 3 months of lying low at work and appearing completely normal while conducting one of the most complex investigations either of them had ever attempted. But by the end of those 3 months, they had something undeniable. They had proof that Admiral Hartley had been diverting military equipment and funds to private security contractors. They had evidence that suggested personal enrichment, that Hartley was using his position to make money for himself through these private contracts. It was corruption, it was fraud, it was serious enough to end an admiral's career. And it was time to move. Marcus knew that going public with this information would be dangerous. Not physically dangerous. This was the United States military, not some third-world dictatorship, but professionally dangerous, career-ending dangerous, the kind of danger that could affect his ability to support his children. So he and his father took precautions. First, they made copies of all their evidence and stored them in multiple locations. Not on military computers, not anywhere that could be easily traced. Instead, they used encrypted drives, cloud storage with dual authentication, and physical documents stored in a safety deposit box at James's bank. Second, they built an anonymous digital presence. Through careful use of VPNs and encrypted email services, they created an email account that couldn't be traced back to either of them. This was the account that would communicate with journalists, with lawmakers, with whoever needed to receive the information. Third, they reached out to a retired military lawyer, someone James had worked with years ago, to get legal advice about the best way to proceed without exposing Marcus to retaliation. "You're describing what's known as a whistleblower situation," the lawyer, a woman named Patricia Morrison, had told them over a carefully scheduled meeting at a coffee shop away from the base. "You need to understand the legal protections that exist for military whistleblowers. You also need to understand that those protections don't always work the way they're supposed to." "So what do we do?" James had asked. "You build a case so airtight that no one can ignore it," Patricia said. "You make sure that when this comes out, it comes out in a way that creates enough public pressure that Hartley can't be protected by his connections. You go to Congress, to the press, to people who have power independent of the military command structure." And so began the next phase of their plan. Marcus and his father, through the anonymous email account they'd created, began reaching out to journalists at major news outlets. They didn't give everything away in the first email. Instead, they provided just enough information to be tantalizing, just enough to make a journalist want to know more. "I have information regarding military equipment diversion and potential corruption at the highest levels of military command," the email read. "This involves a decorated admiral and private security contracts worth millions of dollars. If you're interested in investigating further, reply to this address." It took 2 weeks to get a response. The first reply came from a journalist at the Washington Post named David Chen. He was a reporter who specialized in military corruption and government accountability. He'd won awards for his work. In his reply, David asked specific questions. How did Marcus know this information? What was his role? Did he have documentation? Marcus and his father carefully crafted a response. They didn't give David all the details, but they gave him enough to prove that they had something real. They sent him photographs of documents, not the original documents, but images that confirmed the existence of the financial discrepancies. David Chen wanted to meet in person. They arranged the meeting for a Saturday afternoon at a public park in Raleigh, away from Fort Liberty and away from anyone who might recognize them. Marcus brought his father, and David brought a photographer who would document their meeting as proof of the source. "Before we talk," David said once they were seated on a park bench, "I need to understand your situation. If I publish this story, if this goes public, what happens to you? Marcus had thought about this long and hard. Best case, the truth comes out and justice is served. Worst case, my career is over and I'm marked as a whistleblower forever. And you're willing to accept that? David asked. Marcus thought about Daniel and Tommy. He thought about raising them to understand the importance of doing the right thing. And he realized that if he didn't do this, what lesson would he be teaching them? I'm willing, Marcus said. Over the next 3 hours, Marcus and James walked David through their entire investigation. They explained the data anomalies. They explained the financial connections. They explained how they'd gathered the information. They answered questions, addressed concerns, and provided documentation. By the end of the meeting, David Chen had everything he needed to write a major story about Admiral Hartley's corruption. This is going to take time, David explained. I need to verify everything independently. I need to reach out to my sources in the Pentagon. I need to make sure that when this publishes, it's airtight. The Post doesn't publish stories that can be easily dismissed as rumor or speculation. How long? Marcus asked. 2 months, maybe 3, David said. But when it comes out, it's going to be devastating. You understand that? I understand, Marcus said. For the next 3 months, Marcus lived a double life. During the day, he went to work, did his job, pretended everything was normal. He picked up his kids from school. He helped with homework. He made dinner and played with his boys and tucked them into bed at night. At night, after they were asleep, he communicated with David Chen through encrypted email. He answered follow-up questions. He provided additional documentation. He watched as the journalist slowly built his story, verifying every detail, confirming every anomaly. Meanwhile, Admiral Hartley had no idea what was coming. He continued his public appearances. He gave interviews. He went on speaking engagements about leadership and military strategy. He lived his life as if nothing was wrong, completely unaware that the man he'd mocked in the commissary 3 months ago was building the case that would destroy his career. But something interesting happened during those 3 months. Rumors started circulating on the base. Whispers. People noticed that David Chen, a well-known military correspondent, had been seen meeting with someone near the base. People wondered why there seemed to be an investigation into Admiral Hartley's financial dealings. People started paying attention. Some of those people were allies of Hartley's. Some were people who'd benefited from his patronage. Some were just people who liked gossip. And word eventually got back to Admiral Hartley that something was happening, that someone was investigating him, that there might be a story coming out in the Post. Hartley panicked. He reached out to his connections in Congress. He called in favors from generals who owed him. He had meetings with Pentagon officials. He tried everything he could think of to figure out who was investigating him and what they had. But he couldn't find the source. Because Marcus Webb had been careful, Marcus had covered his tracks. Marcus had been invisible. The Phantom had made the first appearance, and the Admiral was beginning to feel the presence of something dangerous, something unseen, something he couldn't quite grasp or eliminate. 3.5 months after that first meeting with David Chen, the story went live on the Washington Post website, and then in the print edition the next morning. The headline was enormous. SEAL Admiral faces corruption investigation, military equipment diversion and private contractor fraud alleged. Below the headline was a comprehensive account of the financial irregularities, the equipment diversion, the private contracts, and the money trail. David Chen had done his job perfectly. The story was detailed, well-sourced, and absolutely devastating. And right there in the story was the source information. According to a military insider with access to classified financial records and operational data. The Pentagon went into crisis management mode immediately. Within hours, the Department of Defense issued a statement saying that an investigation had been opened into Admiral Hartley's conduct. Within a day, Hartley was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. Within a week, he was asked to resign. He didn't resign quietly. He fought. He denied everything. He claimed the story was politically motivated, that he was being targeted by enemies within the military establishment. But the evidence was too solid. The discrepancies were too clear. The money trail was too obvious. And Marcus Webb, the man Hartley had mocked for being a single parent, for being unimportant, for not being worthy of respect, was the one who'd done it. The irony was perfect. Hartley had tried to make Marcus small, and in doing so had given Marcus a reason that mattered enough to risk his career. The phantom wolf had struck, and Admiral James Hartley would never recover from it. 2 days after the Post story went live, Marcus got a call from David Chen. "There's a problem," David said without preamble, "and I think you need to know about it." "What kind of problem?" Marcus asked, his heart beginning to race. He was at work in his office, and he'd tried to keep his voice level despite the spike of anxiety. "Hartley's people are trying to identify you," David said. "They're putting pressure on Pentagon officials, asking questions about the source. They're claiming the story is inaccurate and that if they can prove it came from someone with a personal vendetta, they can discredit the entire investigation." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd known this was a possibility, but hearing it said out loud was different. "What do we do?" he asked. "I need to protect my sources," David said. "So I won't be revealing anything about you, but you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this becomes about you as well as about Hartley. You need to be ready for scrutiny." After he hung up with David, Marcus sat at his desk for a long time. Around him, other military personnel worked at their tasks, completely unaware that the quiet man in the corner logistics office had just set in motion events that were about to become very public indeed. He called his father. "We should talk to Patricia," James said immediately. "She'll know what to do." Patricia Morrison, their lawyer, was waiting for them at her office downtown. She was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of direct manner that came from decades of military legal work. She'd seen a lot. "So you've become a whistleblower," Patricia said, settling back in her chair. "Congratulations, you've also just made yourself a target." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Marcus asked. "It means that if Hartley's people can figure out it's you, they'll try everything they can to discredit you," Patricia said. "They'll dig into your personal life. They'll look for anything they can use against you. They'll suggest you have a personal vendetta. They'll try to make the story about you instead of about Hartley's corruption." "That doesn't sound legal," Marcus said. "It's not," Patricia agreed. "But that's what they'll do anyway. And here's the thing, even if what they do is illegal, it takes time to prove it and get consequences, time during which they're making your life difficult." "So what do I do?" Marcus asked. "You prepare," Patricia said. "You get your affairs in order. You make sure your relationship with your children is strong. You document everything, and you prepare yourself for the possibility that your military career is over." The words hung in the air between them. Marcus had known this intellectually, but hearing it said out loud was different. His career was over. 12 years of service, 12 years of showing up and doing his job well, 12 years of building something professional and solid. All of it was about to be sacrificed on the altar of truth. But when he thought about Daniel and Tommy, when he thought about what kind of man he wanted them to become, he knew he'd made the right choice. Over the next week, Marcus did exactly what Patricia advised. He documented everything, every email, every conversation, every piece of evidence of his investigation. He recorded dates and times. He built a comprehensive record of everything he'd done. He also reached out to his chain of command and reported the investigation to them officially. This protected him somewhat, because now his command knew he was a whistleblower, which meant they had a legal obligation not to retaliate against him. The retaliation happened anyway. His work assignments changed. He was moved to a different department, one with less responsibility and less visibility. His security clearance was flagged for routine reinvestigation, which meant hours of interviews with investigators asking about his background, his finances, his mental health. He was being systematically isolated. But something unexpected happened as well. Other military personnel started reaching out to him, people who'd worked with Marcus over the years, people who respected him, people who'd heard what he'd done and wanted to support him. Some of them were junior officers who'd been impressed by his integrity. Some were non-commissioned officers who'd worked with him on logistics projects. Some were just people who believed in doing the right thing. "What you did was brave," one colonel told him in a hallway conversation that could have been overheard by anyone. "I hope you know that the good people see what you did. The good people respect it." And there was another development. As the Pentagon investigation into Hartley deepened, other people started coming forward. People who'd seen signs of corruption. people who'd been uncomfortable with Hartley's financial dealings, people who'd been waiting for someone else to move first before they spoke up themselves. Hartley's empire of influence was crumbling because one man, one single father in a logistics office, had decided that the truth mattered more than his career. By the third month after the Post story went live, Hartley had been forced to resign from the military entirely. He faced federal charges for fraud and misappropriation of military property. His consulting company was being investigated. His book was being pulled from shelves. He was radioactive. But Hartley wasn't going to go quietly. In desperation, he made a move that would prove to be his final mistake. He hired private investigators to find out who had leaked the information about his corruption, and he found something interesting in his investigation. He found that Marcus Webb's father, James Webb, had military consulting connections and access to certain databases. He found that James Webb had been asking questions about classified financial records. He put the pieces together. And then, in a moment of rage and desperation, Admiral Hartley made a public accusation. He gave an interview to a friendly news outlet in which he claimed that Marcus Webb, a lowly logistics coordinator, and his retired father had fabricated evidence against him out of personal vendetta and had illegally accessed classified military records. It was a lie. Marcus and his father hadn't illegally accessed anything. Everything they'd reviewed, Marcus had accessed through his legitimate work position. But the accusation was public now, and it was serious. Hartley was trying to flip the narrative. He was trying to make the story about Marcus and James Webb's supposed crimes instead of about his corruption. For one terrible moment, Marcus thought it might work. Then something beautiful happened. The Pentagon released a statement, an official Pentagon statement signed by the Secretary of the Army herself, stating that all evidence reviewed by the investigation supported Marcus Webb's allegations. It stated that Marcus had acted appropriately within his authority. It stated that there was no evidence of any illegal access or data manipulation. It stated that Marcus Webb was a patriotic military officer who had demonstrated the highest integrity in reporting serious criminal conduct. In one sentence, the Pentagon had made Hartley's accusation look not just false, but desperate and pathetic. Hartley's legal team advised him to stop talking, to stop making accusations, to accept his fate quietly and try to minimize the damage. But Admiral James Hartley wasn't a man who accepted fate quietly. He was a man who'd spent his career believing he was untouchable. He was about to learn otherwise. The federal investigation expanded. Prosecutors began looking at not just the equipment diversion, but at Hartley's financial records going back years. They began questioning his consulting contracts. They began discovering a pattern of corruption that went much deeper than anyone had initially realized. And through it all, Marcus Webb went about his life. He went to work. He picked up his children from school. He helped with homework and made dinner and tucked them into bed at night. But the military was watching. The media was watching. And slowly the narrative was shifting from Admiral is being attacked by a low-ranking officer to Admiral is a corrupt criminal who was exposed. The Phantom Wolf had completed its first strike, and the reckoning was only beginning. 4 months after the Post story was published, the federal investigation concluded with the filing of formal charges against Admiral James Hartley. The charges included fraud, conspiracy, misappropriation of military property, and money laundering. It was a comprehensive indictment that detailed years of illegal activity. The Department of Justice held a press conference to announce the charges. It was televised nationally, and at that press conference, the prosecutor made an unusual decision. She publicly thanked the military insider who'd had the courage to report the misconduct. This case would not have been possible without a dedicated military officer who chose integrity over silence, the prosecutor said. This officer risked his career to ensure that the truth was told and justice was served. The Department of Justice commends his bravery. The prosecutor didn't name Marcus directly. His protection as a whistleblower meant his identity remained confidential. But the military community knew. By this point, word had spread through the bases and the Pentagon about who had brought down Admiral Hartley. And the world's response was not what Hartley had predicted. Instead of seeing Marcus as a betrayer, military officers began seeing him as someone who'd upheld the highest values of military service. Instead of being marked as a troublemaker, Marcus was being recognized as someone who'd stood for accountability and integrity. But not everyone was happy about this development. Some of Hartley's allies in the military saw Marcus as a traitor. Some people in the defense contracting world, people who'd benefited from Hartley's corruption, viewed him as a threat. There were whispers, rumors, people suggesting that Marcus had exaggerated his findings or that his motivation was purely personal. It was this narrative that David Chen decided to address directly in a follow-up story. "Can I talk to you about doing an on-the-record interview?" David asked during one of their encrypted email exchanges. "Your name doesn't have to appear, but I want to explain to readers exactly how your investigation was conducted and why your findings are credible." Marcus consulted with Patricia, his lawyer. She advised him that an interview done carefully could actually protect him by putting his story on the record before his enemies could create their own version of events. They set up the interview in a secure location. David came to a hotel room in Charlotte, away from the base and away from anywhere they might be observed. The interview lasted 6 hours. Marcus walked through every step of his investigation. He explained how he'd identified the anomalies in the data. He explained how he'd cross-referenced financial records. He explained how he'd been careful not to illegally access classified material. He explained his motivations, not revenge, but a genuine concern that military resources were being stolen. "Why did you decide to do this?" David asked. "Why risk your career?" Marcus thought about that morning in the commissary. He thought about the humiliation he'd felt, and he decided to tell the truth. "Admiral Hartley mocked me," Marcus said. "He mocked me for being a single parent. He mocked me for trying to balance my career and my responsibility to my children, and in that moment I realized something. I realized that people like Hartley see people like me as irrelevant. They see us as too small to matter." He paused, and his voice became quieter but also more intense. "But we do matter. Our integrity matters. Our willingness to do the right thing matters. And I decided that I wasn't going to let someone like Hartley make me feel small. I was going to show that a single father in a logistics office could see something that powerful people missed. I was going to prove that doing the right thing is worth more than protecting your career." David wrote that quote directly into his article. When the story was published a week later, it became one of the most widely read pieces of the entire investigation. But more importantly, it shifted the narrative completely. The story was no longer about military corruption or missing equipment or private contractors. It was about principle. It was about a man who'd chosen integrity over safety. It was about the idea that whistleblowers aren't heroes in a military sense. They're heroes because they tell the truth when telling the truth costs them something. And suddenly Marcus Webb, quiet logistics coordinator and single father, became a national figure. News outlets wanted to interview him. He was invited to speak at military academies about ethics and integrity. Ethics professors used his case as a teaching example. His story was talked about in Congress. And through all of it, Marcus remained remarkably unchanged. He still picked up his children from school. He still made dinner. He still helped with homework and read bedtime stories and maintained the routine that kept his family stable. But something in him had shifted as well. He'd learned that he was stronger than he'd thought. He'd learned that he could face powerful people and not be diminished by them. He'd learned that doing the right thing, even when it costs you, is the most important thing a person can do. His children learned something too. Daniel and Tommy watched their father be respected by officers and generals. They watched their father be mentioned in newspapers and on television. They learned that their father was not just a logistics coordinator. He was a man of principle and integrity. "Dad, are you famous?" Tommy asked one evening after seeing an article about his father in a military publication. "No," Marcus said gently, "but people know about something I did, and that's because I tried to tell the truth even when it was hard." "Are you a superhero?" Daniel asked. Marcus smiled. "Not a superhero, just a person who did what was right." But in many ways, he was a superhero. He was someone who'd put principle before self-interest. He was someone who'd stood up to power and not been crushed by it. He was someone who'd made the powerful tremble simply by telling the truth. Meanwhile, Admiral James Hartley's life was falling apart. The trial was scheduled for 6 months away, but before the trial even happened, his life was being systematically dismantled. His security clearances were revoked. His consulting contracts were canceled. His book publisher distanced themselves from him. Colleagues who'd praised him for years suddenly wouldn't answer his calls. The military establishment, which had once protected him, was now abandoning him. Because once you're exposed as corrupt, once the truth is undeniable, you become a liability. You become someone people want to distance themselves from. Hartley was no longer an admiral. He was just a man facing federal charges, watching his reputation collapse, watching everything he'd built crumble to dust. And it had all begun because he'd mocked someone he'd considered beneath his notice. The irony was devastating. 3 months before the trial, Hartley's legal team reached out to the prosecutor's office with a proposal. Hartley wanted to plead guilty to all charges. He wanted to avoid trial. He was willing to accept a prison sentence if it meant avoiding the full public spectacle of a trial where every detail of his corruption would be exposed. The prosecutor accepted the deal. On the day of the sentencing, Marcus sat in the courtroom gallery. His father sat next to him. They'd chosen to come to witness the conclusion of the journey that had begun 18 months earlier. Judge Martha Henderson read through Hartley's crimes: fraud, conspiracy, misappropriation of military property, money laundering. The crimes amassed to decades of illegal activity. "Admiral Hartley," the judge said, "you stand before this court convicted of serious crimes committed while holding a position of trust and authority. You violated that trust. You violated military law. You violated the oath you took to support and defend the Constitution of the United States." The judge paused, and her expression was grave. "You are sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, to be followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will also forfeit all military pension benefits and return all improperly obtained funds to the military department." As the sentence was read, Hartley's face showed nothing. He'd already accepted the outcome. He'd already prepared himself for prison. This was just the formal conclusion of a process that had begun the moment Marcus Webb first noticed the financial anomalies. As Marcus and his father left the courthouse, reporters surrounded them, calling out questions. Marcus didn't answer. His lawyer, Patricia, stepped forward and gave a brief statement. "My client is pleased that justice has been served," Patricia said. "He took enormous risks to report serious misconduct, and the judicial system has validated his decision to come forward. He hopes this case demonstrates that military personnel who witness wrongdoing have a responsibility and a legal right to report it." Later that evening, Marcus called David Chen. "It's over," Marcus said simply. "It is," David agreed. "And you did it. You brought down a corrupt admiral just by telling the truth." "My father helped," Marcus said. "And you helped, and Patricia helped. It was never just me." "No," David said, "but it started with you. It started with you being brave enough to look at the data and realize something was wrong, and brave enough to do something about it." After he hung up with David, Marcus sat with his children and watched them eat dinner. Daniel was telling him about his day at school, a story about a friend and a playground adventure. Tommy was listening, occasionally interjecting his own comments. Normal children living normal lives, completely unaware of the momentous events their father had been part of. Marcus knew that his life would never be completely normal again. The whistleblower label would follow him forever. There would be people who distrusted him or disliked him for what he'd done. His military career, while not officially over, would never advance the way it might have before. But looking at his children, listening to them talk about their days, seeing them happy and safe and loved, Marcus understood that he'd made the right choice. The Phantom Wolf had completed its hunt. And now it was time to return to being just Marcus Webb, logistics coordinator, single father, and a man who'd learned that his quiet strength mattered more than he'd ever imagined. A year after Admiral Hartley's sentencing, Marcus received an unexpected letter. It was from the Secretary of the Army herself. The letter was official and formal, but the message was clear. "Major Marcus Webb," it read, "in recognition of your exceptional service and your courageous reporting of serious misconduct, the Department of the Army is pleased to announce your promotion to the rank of Major, effective immediately. Your integrity and dedication to the values of military service have set an example for all officers and enlisted personnel. We commend you for your bravery." It was an extraordinary gesture. Typically, whistleblowers weren't promoted quickly after their reports. They weren't rewarded. They were often sidelined or pushed out. But the Secretary of the Army had decided to do something different. She decided to publicly validate what Marcus had done by giving him a promotion that he'd already earned through his years of service, but had been held up by the investigation and his whistleblower status. When Marcus told his father, James wept. "You did it," James said. "You stood up to power, you told the truth, and the system worked. It actually worked." "We did it," Marcus corrected, putting his arm around his father's shoulders. "I couldn't have done this alone." That evening, Marcus called his children to sit with him in the living room. "I have something to tell you," he said to Daniel and Tommy, "and I want you to understand why this matters." He told them, in language they could understand, about Admiral Hartley and about the corruption he'd discovered. He told them about making a choice to tell the truth even though it was difficult and scary. He told them about the consequences and the rewards. "Does this mean you're famous now?" Tommy asked. "It means people know about something I did," Marcus said. "And more importantly, it means that I did the right thing even when it was hard, and that's the most important thing a person can do." Over the following months, Marcus settled into his new role. His promotion came with a new assignment. He was transferred to the Inspector General's office, the same office responsible for investigating military misconduct. It was ironic, and it was perfect. The military wanted to use his expertise and his proven integrity to help root out other instances of corruption. Marcus was now officially part of the system that caught bad actors and held them accountable. He worked with several other officers who, inspired by his example, had begun reporting their own concerns about command misconduct. He helped establish new training programs about reporting misconduct and protecting whistleblowers. He became, in many ways, the face of military integrity. But Marcus never forgot where he'd come from. He never forgot that he was still a single father. He still picked up his children from school. He still helped with homework. He still maintained the routine that had kept him sane through all the chaos of the past 18 months. And he stayed close to the people who'd helped him. He regularly met with his father for their Tuesday morning coffee. He maintained his friendship with David Chen, the journalist who'd been part of exposing Hartley. And he worked regularly with Patricia Morrison, his lawyer, who'd helped navigate the legal complexities of his whistleblower status. 2 years after Admiral Hartley's conviction, Marcus was invited to speak at the United States Military Academy at West Point. It was a profound honor. He was invited to address cadets about military ethics and integrity. Standing in front of 500 future officers, Marcus shared his story. He told them about Admiral Hartley. He told them about the moment in the commissary. He told them about the choice he'd made to look at the data carefully and to report what he'd found. "There will be moments in your military careers," Marcus told the cadets, "when you'll have to choose between comfort and integrity. You'll see things that are wrong. You'll see corruption or abuse of power or people being treated unfairly, and you'll have to decide whether you're brave enough to speak up." He paused and looked out at the young faces watching him. "I won't lie to you," he said. "Speaking up is hard, it costs you. I lost opportunities, I faced retaliation. My career is different than it might have been. But I also got something in return. I got the knowledge that I did the right thing. I got respect from people who matter. And I got to show my children what integrity looks like." "Integrity is the easiest thing to have until you actually have to choose it," Marcus continued. "And then it becomes the hardest thing in the world. But I'm here to tell you that it's worth it. That choosing the truth over comfort, that choosing principle over self-interest, those choices make you the kind of officer that the military actually needs." After his speech, cadets lined up to talk to him. They asked questions about his investigation. They asked about his experiences with retaliation. They asked about how he'd stayed strong when things got difficult. One young woman cadet approached him after the others had left. "I'm from a single-parent home," she said. "My mom raised me in the military, and hearing your story about raising your children while serving, about proving that you belonged in the military even when someone powerful tried to tell you that you didn't, it means something to me." Marcus felt something warm settle in his chest. "Then maybe my story is worth telling," he said. "Good luck with your career, cadet. The military needs people like you, people like us, people who understand that service isn't just about yourself." In the years that followed, Marcus continued to rise in rank. He made colonel. He led increasingly important divisions focused on military accountability and ethics. He published papers on detecting corruption and establishing systems of accountability. But more importantly, he became known for something else. He became known as someone who cared about people, someone who listened when junior officers came to him with concerns, someone who, having survived the experience of whistleblowing himself, understood how to protect others who came forward with evidence of misconduct. And through it all, Admiral Hartley sat in a federal prison in West Virginia, his 10-year sentence stretching out before him. He'd been stripped of his title, his pension, his reputation. He was no longer Admiral Hartley. He was inmate number 47,362. Marcus rarely thought about Hartley anymore. He'd moved past anger or vindication. He'd achieved something better. He'd achieved justice, and in doing so, he'd helped create a system where people like Hartley would have a harder time committing crimes in the future. 3 years after his promotion to major, Marcus was sitting in his office at the Pentagon when his secretary told him he had a visitor. It was James Webb, Marcus's father. "You need to take a break," James said without preamble. "The boys are on spring break next week and we're going to take them camping, just like we used to." Marcus smiled. It was something they'd started doing years ago, before all the chaos of the Hartley investigation. They'd take Daniel and Tommy out to a remote area of the Blue Ridge Mountains and camp in tents and hike and fish. "I can't leave right now," Marcus started to say, but James cut him off. "Yes, you can. You've earned it. The military will survive without you for a week." And so the next week, Marcus and his father took Daniel and Tommy camping. They pitched tents and built a campfire. They told stories and roasted marshmallows. They sat under the stars and talked about life and choices and the importance of doing what's right. One evening, sitting around the campfire, Tommy asked his father a question. "Dad, was Admiral Hartley a bad guy?" Marcus thought about that carefully before answering. "He was a person who made bad choices," Marcus said. "He let power go to his head. He convinced himself that the rules didn't apply to him because he was important. And by the time he realized that his choices had consequences, it was too late." "Are you glad you stopped him?" Daniel asked. "I'm glad that the truth came out," Marcus said. "Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because truth matters. Because when people have power, we need systems to make sure they don't abuse it. And we need people brave enough to report when they do." Later that night, after the boys were asleep, Marcus and his father sat by the dying campfire. "You've done good," James said quietly. "You've made a difference, I hope you know that." "We've done good," Marcus corrected, "and we're not done yet." "No," James agreed. "But you don't have to do it alone anymore. Other people understand what we learned. Other people are paying attention now." They sat in companionable silence, watching the embers glow. Marcus thought about that morning in the commissary when Admiral Hartley had mocked him. He thought about how small he'd felt in that moment, and he thought about how far he'd come since then. He'd learned that being quiet didn't mean being weak. He'd learned that being a single father didn't diminish his value as an officer. He'd learned that one person, armed with the truth and the courage to tell it, could change the entire system. Most importantly, he'd learned that principle mattered more than comfort, that integrity was worth the cost. Admiral Hartley had tried to make Marcus Webb feel small. Instead, he'd awakened something in him. He'd awakened the phantom wolf, not a ghost or a spirit, but the part of Marcus that understood when to wait, when to watch, and when to strike with the force of truth. And now, years later, Marcus was finally at peace. He had his children, he had his father, he had a career that mattered, he had the knowledge that he'd done the right thing. He looked at the stars above the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he understood something fundamental about the nature of courage and integrity. It wasn't about being the strongest or the loudest or the most powerful. It was about being willing to stand alone if necessary. It was about believing in something bigger than yourself. It was about understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth. The phantom wolf had completed its hunt, and now it could finally rest.